Welcome back to the IBFP. Here's your host, Boxing New.
Disclaimer, the views expressed in this video are solely based on facts, yet some people will still deny the truth. You can't convince a moron not to be stupid. Myth: Canelo Alvarez cherry-picked Avni Yildirim to avoid David Benavidez and Charlo. Look, let's just break it down honestly and objectively as possible. And we start with a few interesting statements. And the first one comes from Mustafa Bayan, stated that, people said Floyd was a cherry picker. But what about Canelo Alvarez in regards to fighting Avni Yildirim? NK True states that Avni Yildirim was not Canelo Alvarez mandatory. He was handpicked, and Canelo Alvarez requested to fight Avni Yildirim. So look, let's just break it down. And we start with a sequence of events that tells the true tale. And we start back in 2019 was Avni Yildirim was reinstated as the mandatory challenger for the WBC title at 168 pounds. So that pretty much debunks what anybody says about this. Avni Yildirim was the mandatory for the WBC title back in 2019. He was reinstated. So this was long before Canelo Alvarez even had the belt. This was long before Canelo even thought about having the belt. So how can this be a cherry pick from Canelo when he was reinstated as the mandatory back in 2019? If you disagree, if you don't believe it to be true, slap yourself, because you're a moron, idiot, and a dummy. But let's just keep going. David Benavidez was then stripped of the WBC title, which is why he never fought Avni Yildirim as his mandatory, because he was stripped because he couldn't lay off the cheeseburgers, the tacos, the empanadas. The guy couldn't put the fork down, and he was stripped of the title back in 2020. So Yildirim was reinstated as the mandatory in 2019. David Benavidez was stripped of the title in 2020. And then after that, the WBC had received requests from Canelo Alvarez, David Benavidez, and Callum Smith, amongst others, to face Avni Yildirim for the world title at 168 pounds because it was a vacant belt. So who would ever win that belt would have to fight Avni Yildirim. You couldn't win the title without him being included, without him being in the mix. So whoever was going to get the belt, whether it was David Benavidez getting it back, whether it was going to be Callum Smith or Canelo Alvarez, they would all have to be lined up to face Avni Yildirim because he was the mandatory since 2019. But here's the interesting thing. When you see the headline, Canelo Alvarez requested to fight Avni Yildirim, that's very misleading. Because no matter who was going to fight Yildirim, they were all going to have to go through him to get that belt at 168 pounds if you wanted it. That includes David Benavidez. He was lined up as the mandatory before Canelo even had the belt. These moron idiots and dummies simply don't understand that. But here's the most interesting thing. Canelo Alvarez didn't even fight Avni Yildirim for the belt. He ended up facing the number one fighter at 168 pounds and an undefeated world champion in his prime, Callum Smith, who was a WBA and ring champion at the time, and they fought in a unification fight for that WBC title. So let's just be honest. And why did he fight Callum Smith for that belt? Because Avni Yildirim took a step aside to allow Canelo Alvarez to fight a unification fight with the number one fighter in the division, and they had agreed, Canelo and Callum Smith as well as Avni Yildirim, to fight. The winner of that fight would take on Avni Yildirim within 90 days. So Canelo Alvarez fought Avni Yildirim 3 months after he beat Callum Smith. Why? Because he had already agreed after he defeated the number one fighter at 168 pounds. See, you got to understand, it's impossible to cherry pick a mandatory. This guy was mandatory before Canelo Alvarez had the belt. So what the hell are you talking about? This guy was a mandatory since 2019. It was impossible for this to be a cherry pick. Because if Canelo ever wanted the WBC title, if he ever wanted to be undisputed, which he stated he wanted to be undisputed, he wants to make history at 168 pounds. There's never been somebody to be undisputed at 168, and Canelo wants to make history by doing that. He could not do that unless he faces Avni Yildirim at some point. This was impossible to be a cherry pick. Only a moron, idiot, and a dummy would believe that. And we got another interesting question from my brother Outstrike, and he states, a lot of people are saying that, why didn't Canelo want the belt when David Benavidez had it? Also, they've been saying that Canelo went up in weight to avoid a fight with Charlo. Can you explain to them why both aren't true? We'll start with David Benavidez. How could Canelo Alvarez look to fight David Benavidez when he already had 2 title defenses lined up for 2020? He was booked for the entire year. Canelo Alvarez couldn't even fight the guy. He couldn't even fight for the belt in 2020 because he didn't have a belt to unify. That's the only way Canelo Alvarez could trump that mandatory, is by making it a unification fight. So Canelo Alvarez had thrown out multiple offers that year to Billy Joe Saunders and Callum Smith, trying to get one of those fights done. Those were the fights he were pursuing. Those were the fights he was trying to get done. And that's the fight he ultimately took against Callum Smith. So as you see, it was impossible for Canelo Alvarez to face David Benavidez while he had 2 fights lined up, one against Romer Alexis Angulo and the other against Avni Yildirim, his mandatory. And he couldn't trump the mandatory because he would not have been a unification fight. That's facts. But let's just keep it going. Not only that, Charlo, Canelo Alvarez moved up to avoid a guy, and Charlo makes no sense because Charlo already turned down a Canelo Alvarez fight. It's like these fanboys ignore facts. He's already turned down the fight. He's already said he don't want no smoke with Canelo Alvarez. He wants to keep cherry picking Brandon Adams, Dennis Hogan, Deverenchenko off a loss. He does not want smoke with the best pound for pound fighter in the world. And anybody disagreeing, anybody saying it's not true, you got to look at the facts, because men lie, women lie, but the facts don't lie.